During Japan's Edo period, from 1603 to 1868, the nation lived under a closed and highly regulated order. The Tokugawa shogunate imposed strict control over every layer of society, shaping how people dressed, spoke, and even how they died. Within this rigid structure, the samurai were not just warriors, but symbols of discipline and honor. Their code of conduct, Bushido, was merciless in its demands, extending its influence not only over men but also over women. For samurai men, defeat on the battlefield could be redeemed through a sword and the ritual of seppuku, plunging the blade into one's abdomen to preserve honor. Yet, what is far less known is that women, especially the wives of samurai, carried an equally terrifying burden of honor. From the very day of their marriage, many young women were expected to swear that if the family's honor was ever threatened, they would take their own lives, without hesitation. This act was not seen as an expression of despair, but as a binding oath of honor, a vow that tied them to their husband's household, transforming them into symbols of loyalty and sacrifice. Rather than endure shame or humiliation, they chose death calm, deliberate, and sanctified by duty. In doing so, they believed they safeguarded the dignity of their family's name, even in their final breath. The story becomes even more haunting when we learn that many Edo brides kept a small dagger close at hand on their wedding night. Hidden inside the wide sleeve of their kimono or laid carefully beside their pillow, this blade was more than just a weapon. It was the key to honor, the final escape if life cornered them with disgrace. Some historical accounts even describe how women tied a strip of cloth around their heads before the act, ensuring their face would remain composed and recognizable even in death, a detail as tragic as it is chilling. So how did marriage, the supposed beginning of happiness, turn into a bloody covenant? Why did women in Edo Japan view death in honor as more valuable than life itself? Was Jigai, the ritual suicide of women, a demonstration of unbreakable strength, or merely the cruel consequence of a society that demanded everything, even life, in the name of honor? In the chapters to come, we will uncover the origins of Jigai, the cultural weight it carried, and the harrowing stories of women bound to this deadly oath of loyalty. To understand why women in Edo Japan accepted such a deadly oath of honor, we must first look at the practice known as Jigai. While samurai men had seppuku, the ritual of cutting open the stomach to preserve dignity, samurai women had their own path, Jigai. Instead of plunging a sword into the abdomen, women used a small dagger, a tanto, to sever the arteries of the neck or throat. This method was considered quicker, less prolonged in suffering, and still solemn in its symbolism. Jigai was not simply an act of despair. It was deeply rooted in the cultural values of Bushido, the way of the warrior, which elevated honor above life itself. Bushido bound men to live and die as warriors, but for women it was reshaped into a duty tied to marriage and family. Once married, a woman was expected to protect not only her husband's household, but also its reputation. If dishonor approached, her life became the ultimate sacrifice. The origins of Jigai trace back to centuries before Edo, when samurai clans were locked in endless wars. Castles under siege created a dreadful reality. Men fought to the death, but women risked humiliation, enslavement, or worse. In such desperate times, Jigai emerged as a way for women to die with dignity rather than live in shame. Records tell of wives and daughters who ended their lives before the enemy could take them, and in many tragic cases, mothers killed their own children before committing Jigai themselves, believing it was an act of mercy. By the Edo period, Jigai had become more than an emergency measure. It entered the framework of marriage itself. On their wedding night, some brides were given a small dagger as a symbolic gift. To outsiders, it looked like a ceremonial object, polished and ornamental. But for the bride, it carried a darker meaning. Should dishonor ever touch the household, this blade would serve as the final duty she could perform for her family. Unlike seppuku, which was often a public event with witnesses and attendants, Jigai was carried out in solitude. A samurai man might have another warrior standing by, to swiftly decapitate him after the abdominal cut, ensuring a quick death. But women were left alone, in silence, beneath the glow of an oil lamp. Before the act, they tied their hair neatly to avoid disarray. Then, dressed in white kimono, the traditional color of death. This ritualized preparation was as much a declaration as the act itself. They were ready to step into death with composure. Confucian values, imported from China, further reinforced the practice. Women were taught the strict doctrine of obedience, to follow their fathers in youth, their husbands in marriage, and their sons in widowhood. For samurai wives, this loyalty extended even beyond life. Jigai became the ultimate expression of obedience, dying not just for personal pride, but for the preservation of the entire household's honor. Historical chronicles and oral accounts reveal that many brides, some no older than 18 or 20, were forced to live under the shadow of this expectation. The bridal chamber itself often contained a discreet place to keep the dagger, a silent reminder that their new role came with a permanent obligation. What for others might have been a symbol of love and new beginnings, for these women was also a symbol of potential death. Thus, Jigai was not merely an individual act of choice. It was the product of a society that demanded sacrifice from its women as a means of maintaining order and dignity. In a culture where a woman's worth was defined by her loyalty and capacity to endure, Jigai stood as the ultimate brutal proof of her virtue. The abstract idea of Jigai becomes far more chilling when we look at the stories of the women who actually performed it. These were not just faceless figures in dusty chronicles. They were young brides, loyal wives, and mothers whose lives were defined by duty, and whose deaths became unforgettable echoes of a society obsessed with honor. One of the most haunting accounts comes from the fall of Aizu Castle during the Boshin War in the late Edo period. As enemy forces closed in, and the samurai defenders prepared for their final stand, the women of the fortress were faced with an impossible choice: surrender and risk dishonor, or die by their own hands. Many chose Jigai. Dressed in white kimono, their hair tied neatly, they knelt with calm faces as they pressed their daggers to their throats. Mothers are said to have taken the lives of their children first, cradling them gently before turning the blade upon themselves. When the castle finally fell, the victors discovered not captives, but a hall lined with bodies, serene in death, yet terrifying in their collective defiance. Other stories revolve not around war, but around the intimate cruelties of domestic life. In Edo society, purity was seen as the foundation of a woman's worth. A whisper of suspicion could destroy her reputation. There are tales of young brides, accused by their husbands of infidelity or of not being virgins, who resorted to Jigai to prove their innocence. Rather than endure the shame of accusation, they chose death, believing that their blood would speak louder than their words. To the community, these acts were sometimes praised as the ultimate proof of loyalty and chastity. Yet to modern eyes, they reveal a devastating truth. Women lived in a world where even rumors could cost them their lives. The ritual itself was marked by a disturbing attention to detail. Women prepared themselves carefully, ensuring that their final appearance would be dignified. They tied a cloth around their heads so their hair would not fall into disarray. They dressed in white, a color of mourning and purity, transforming themselves into living funerary figures. By doing so, they turned their deaths into symbolic performances, affirming the ideals of Bushido even as life drained away. For outsiders, such rituals seemed unfathomable, yet within Edo culture, they were admired as expressions of strength and unbreakable resolve. Foreign travelers and chroniclers in Japan often wrote with a mix of fascination and horror about these customs. To European observers, Jigai represented a strange and barbaric devotion to abstract ideals. They saw young women calmly embracing death, their faces composed, their actions deliberate, and wondered how such serenity could coexist with such brutality. Japanese poets, meanwhile, sometimes praised these deaths in verse, casting them as blossoms falling in the wind, brief, beautiful, and tragically inevitable. Yet behind the romanticized imagery lay suffocating pressure. Women were caught between two forces: the expectation of loyalty and the fear of dishonor. A marriage that should have represented love and security often became a binding chain where even the hint of failure could end in blood. Jigai was both submission and rebellion. Submission to the code that demanded their lives, and rebellion against a world that offered no other choice. Consider the case of Lady Nakano Takeko. Though not remembered for Jigai but for her battlefield death, she led an army of women during the Boshin War, fighting bravely before being struck down. Realizing she was mortally wounded, she begged her sister to behead her so the enemy could not take her as a trophy. Her story highlights the same principle. For women of the samurai class, dying with honor was often preferable to living in shame. Jigai was simply the domestic counterpart to this martial spirit, a quieter, blood-stained echo of the same values. Even in peaceful times, the practice loomed like a shadow. Brides entering their new homes knew that the dagger lying discreetly in the chamber was not a decoration. It was a reminder that their very existence was conditional upon flawless loyalty. Some women are said to have rehearsed the motions, preparing themselves in case the moment ever arrived. To live as a samurai wife meant living with death as a constant companion. These stories are not easy to hear. They challenge us to reconsider how deeply a society can ingrain ideas of honor, loyalty, and duty, even at the cost of life. For the women of Edo Japan, Jigai was not an extraordinary event. It was the unspoken end written into the vows of marriage, a choice they carried silently, day after day. Their calm acceptance of death reveals not only their strength, but also the cruel weight of a system that valued reputation above human life. Jigai was more than a personal decision. It became a mechanism that shaped the very structure of Edo society. Through it, women were transformed into guardians of household reputation, carrying a responsibility that reached far beyond themselves. While men bore the duty of protecting the clan on the battlefield, women were tasked with safeguarding the clan's honor in the private sphere, even if that meant paying with their lives. In this sense, Jigai functioned as a powerful tool of social control. A wife who lived under the constant reminder of the dagger was not just a partner in marriage. She was a living embodiment of loyalty. Families knew that their daughters-in-law would not allow dishonor to taint the lineage. The mere presence of the practice deterred transgressions, because every woman was conditioned to accept the inevitability of sacrifice. But the cost was devastating. Jigai created an atmosphere of fear-driven obedience, where even the smallest suspicion could push a woman towards self-destruction. A careless rumor, a harsh word from a husband, or the threat of scandal was enough to trigger the fatal act. Rather than being a symbol of strength alone, Jigai exposed the fragility of women's positions in Edo Japan. Their lives were perpetually conditional, hanging by the thin thread of reputation. There are accounts of mass Jigai during sieges, where dozens of women ended their lives together when a castle fell. These tragic spectacles were remembered not only as acts of loyalty, but also as demonstrations of the clan's unbreakable spirit. In such moments, women became extensions of the samurai ethos, warriors of the inner chambers, who fought with silence and blood instead of swords. Yet, society's praise for such sacrifices was double-edged. On one hand, women who committed Jigai were honored as paragons of devotion. Their names might be recorded in family chronicles. Poems might celebrate their cherry blossom-like deaths. On the other hand, the expectation of Jigai placed unbearable pressure on countless women who never wished to embrace it. Unlike samurai men who often chose seppuku as a matter of pride, many women performed Jigai, not from personal resolve, but from coercion driven by fear of bringing shame upon their families. The gendered disparity was stark. Men could reclaim honor through battle or ritual death, actions celebrated in epic tales and martial songs. Women, however, were largely confined to the domestic sphere, where their honor hinged on obedience, purity, and sacrifice. Jigai thus revealed the hidden injustice of Edo society. It praised women's loyalty, while simultaneously denying them the right to live freely. Over time, as Japan entered the late Edo and early Meiji periods, voices began to question the practice. Reformers criticized it as a remnant of feudal cruelty, incompatible with the modernization of the nation. As Western influences grew, the value of individual life slowly gained recognition. The image of women as perpetual guardians of family honor began to shift, though not without resistance. Still, the legacy of Jigai endured. It left behind a cultural memory that tied women's identities to sacrifice, shaping literature, theater, and even modern interpretations of loyalty. Plays and stories continued to portray heroines who died with calm dignity, reinforcing ideals long after the practice itself faded. Even today, the haunting image of the white-clad samurai wife, dagger in hand, remains etched in Japan's historical imagination. The consequences of Jigai were thus both immediate and enduring. It preserved family honor in the short term, but left generations of women living under the weight of potential death. It created stories that inspired awe, yet also instilled fear. And most of all, it revealed the cruel paradox of Edo society, that honor, celebrated as the highest virtue, was maintained through the destruction of life. As Japan moved into the Meiji era, the practice of Jigai began to fade. The country was rapidly modernizing, opening its doors to Western ideas and values that emphasized the sanctity of individual life. Ritual suicide, once glorified as a mark of devotion, now came under scrutiny as a relic of feudal cruelty. Jigai, with its quiet brutality, was gradually abandoned, yet its memory did not vanish. It remained a haunting reminder of how deeply a society could bind women's lives to the notion of honor. The story of Jigai forces us to confront a difficult question. Was it truly an expression of strength, or was it the product of oppression? For some, Jigai represented an unyielding will, a refusal to be humiliated or reduced by circumstance. These women chose death on their own terms, transforming their final moments into acts of defiance. But for many others, Jigai was not a choice at all. It was a demand, imposed upon them by a society that offered no other escape. When we look at the image of a bride in her white kimono, dagger by her side, we see both pride and tragedy. She is poised, calm, and resolute, yet her life has been reduced to a single expectation, that she must die if called upon. In celebrating such deaths, Edo society elevated loyalty but stripped away freedom. Today, the idea that honor is more valuable than life feels distant, almost unthinkable. And yet, the echoes of Jigai remind us how fragile human dignity can become when defined by rigid social codes. What appears as virtue on the surface can conceal unimaginable cruelty beneath. Jigai teaches us that honor, when turned into an absolute, can destroy the very lives it claims to protect. It warns us of the dangers of a system where individuals, especially women, are valued not for their humanity, but for their ability to uphold an image. In remembering these women, we must honor not only their strength, but also their suffering. Their calm acceptance of death was not just a personal act of courage, it was also a silent cry against the weight of a society that demanded too much. The haunting legacy of Jigai endures as both a cultural memory and a moral lesson. It asks us to reflect. What is the true meaning of honor, and what are we willing to sacrifice for it? In answering, we may finally give voice to the women who lived and died bound by an oath that should never have been written in blood.